Most people don't have a negative life. They have an undisciplined mind. This distinction changes everything. A negative life suggests bad luck, unfair circumstances, or external opposition. An undisciplined mind points somewhere far less comfortable, inward. It implies that what keeps most people trapped is not what happens to them, but what they allow to repeat unchecked inside their own head. Negative thinking is rarely dramatic. It does not arrive as a single catastrophic belief. It seeps in quietly, through repetition, familiarity, and unexamined habits. It sounds reasonable, it feels justified, and because it feels familiar, it is rarely questioned. This is why negative thinking is so dangerous. Not because it is loud, but because it is normal. Jim Rohn understood this long before mindset became a commodity. His message was never about motivation as adrenaline. It was about mental governance. The idea that a human life rises or collapses according to what is tolerated in the mind on a daily basis. Tolerance is the real enemy. People believe their problem is the presence of negative thoughts. It is not. The problem is the permission those thoughts are given to stay, multiply, and shape behavior. The mind, left unmanaged, does not drift toward clarity. It drifts toward entropy. Like an unattended garden, it grows whatever requires the least effort. Weeds do not need encouragement. They only need neglect. Negative thinking follows the same law. It grows fastest when discipline is absent, when attention is scattered, and when the individual mistakes familiarity for truth. Over time, these thoughts harden into identity. What began as passing commentary becomes an internal narrator. Eventually, it feels like who you are. This is the moment most people mistake for fate. But it is not fate. It is habit. The mind is not a neutral observer of reality. It is a filtering system. Whatever it rehearses, it reinforces. Whatever it repeats, it believes. And whatever it believes, it acts out, quietly, consistently, without drama. This is why changing circumstances without changing thinking rarely works. A new job, a new relationship, or a new environment may offer temporary relief, but the same patterns reassert themselves because the internal structure has not changed. Jim Rohn's central insight was simple but ruthless. Personal development is not optional. It is daily maintenance. The idea that self-improvement is something you do when life becomes unbearable is precisely why life becomes unbearable in the first place. Waiting for pain to force change guarantees unnecessary suffering. Discipline practiced early prevents chaos later. The mind that is trained daily does not need rescuing. It does not require constant motivation. It operates from structure rather than impulse. Reading, writing goals, reflecting. These are not inspirational rituals. They are forms of mental hygiene. Neglect hygiene long enough, and infection is inevitable. Negative thinking thrives in unstructured time. It fills silence when there is no direction. It exploits fatigue when attention is low. It weaponizes past mistakes when the present lacks purpose. This is why regret is such a powerful toxin. Most people do not suffer because of what they did wrong. They suffer because they replay what they did wrong long after the lesson has been extracted. The past becomes a psychological parasite, feeding on attention without producing insight. Jim Rohn was explicit about this. The past is a classroom, not a prison. Once the lesson is learned, continued self-punishment is not wisdom, it is indulgence. It feels productive because it feels serious, but it produces nothing. It drains energy that could be used for construction. Construction requires forward motion. Yet many people confuse reflection with rumination. Reflection clarifies. Rumination paralyzes. One leads to adjustment. The other leads to identity collapse. The mind that cannot release the past cannot move decisively in the present. This is where comparison enters. Comparison is the fastest way to poison forward motion. It reframes life as a race with imaginary competitors and invisible finish lines. It ignores context, timing, and individual trajectory. Most importantly, it erodes self-trust. The moment you measure yourself against someone else's timeline, you abandon your own. Jim Rohn's insistence on personal standards was not motivational fluff. It was strategic. When progress is measured against your own previous behavior, Improvement becomes possible when progress is measured against others. Clarity disappears. Comparison replaces responsibility with resentment. And resentment is one of the most fertile breeding grounds for negative thinking. The mind begins to narrate injustice. It rehearses stories of unfairness. It justifies stagnation by externalizing blame. Over time, the individual feels both morally superior and helpless, a psychologically corrosive combination. Decisiveness is the antidote. Indecision keeps the mind in a loop of hypothetical futures and imagined failures. It feels safe because nothing is risked. But safety purchased through stagnation has a long-term cost: erosion of confidence. Confidence is built through commitment, not certainty. Jim Rohn emphasized decision not because decisions guarantee success, but because indecision guarantees mental decay. Once a decision is made and backed by action, feedback arrives, correction becomes possible, momentum begins. Waiting for perfect conditions is a sophisticated form of avoidance. Negative thinking loves avoidance because it preserves the illusion of potential. As long as nothing is attempted, nothing is disproven, the ego remains intact, but so does mediocrity. Action exposes flaws, but it also exposes strength. This is why emotional reactivity must be replaced with deliberate response. Reaction is automatic. Response is chosen. Reaction hands control to circumstance. Response retains authorship. The pause between stimulus and response is where identity is shaped. Most people live as if that pause does not exist. They react, justify, repeat. Over time, this pattern hardens into personality. They call it, "just how I am," unaware that it is simply how they have been practicing. High-performance thinking is not optimism. It is solution orientation. It trains the mind to ask different questions. Not, "Why is this happening to me?" but "What is required now?" This shift is subtle. It removes drama. It removes self-pity. And it removes many excuses people have relied on to avoid growth. Identity must be rebuilt on strength, not damage. When a person defines themselves by trauma, failure, or labels imposed by others, negative thinking becomes self-protective. Letting go of the narrative feels like losing proof of suffering. But strength-based identity does not deny pain. It refuses to center it. You become what you act like repeatedly. This is why environment matters. Not because other people control you, but because they normalize certain patterns of thought. Proximity to chronic negativity lowers standards without announcing itself. Over time, it becomes contagious. Distance is sometimes an act of self-respect. This does not require hostility. It requires clarity. Protecting your mental environment is not arrogance. It is maintenance. And maintenance is what allows forward motion even when circumstances are hostile. The final commitment Jim Rohn spoke about, the decision to win, is not magical thinking. It is a refusal to exit early. It is the internal line past which quitting is no longer an option. Not because success is guaranteed, but because character is being built. And character, once formed, outlasts any single outcome. Most people already know what to do. That is the part no one likes to admit. They know they should read instead of scrolling, reflect instead of complaining, act instead of hesitating, and discipline their thinking instead of indulging it. The problem is not ignorance. The problem is resistance. And resistance rarely announces itself as fear. It disguises itself as mood, timing, doubt, and fatigue. Negative thinking is not just a set of thoughts. It is a protective mechanism designed to keep the individual inside familiar psychological territory, even when that territory is painful. The mind prefers familiar pain to unfamiliar effort. This is why people return to the same patterns they claim to hate. The known feels controllable. The unknown requires growth. Growth threatens identity. And identity, once formed, defends itself aggressively. This is why killing negative thinking feels like violence to the ego. You are not removing thoughts. You are dismantling a structure that once served a purpose. That purpose may have been survival, avoidance, or emotional protection, but it is no longer aligned with who you are trying to become. Jim Rohn's work implicitly recognized this conflict. He did not treat negative thinking as a moral flaw. He treated it as a management problem. If the mind is left unmanaged, it will default to the lowest energy pattern available. Complaining is low energy. Blame is low energy. Comparison is low energy. Discipline is high energy at first, which is why it is resisted. But over time, discipline becomes the lowest energy state because chaos is exhausting. This is where most people fail. They attempt to change their thinking without changing their standards. They want better thoughts while continuing to tolerate mental clutter. They want confidence while continuing to indulge doubt. They want progress without discomfort. But the mind does not work on wishes. It works on reinforcement. Whatever you rehearse, you reinforce. Whatever you tolerate, you teach yourself is acceptable. Negative thinking survives because it is tolerated under the illusion of realism. People call it being honest, practical, or just being aware of the risks. But realism without agency is pessimism in disguise. True realism includes the capacity to act. Without that, awareness becomes paralysis. Jim Rohn consistently redirected attention away from emotional narration and back toward behavior. Not because emotions do not matter, but because behavior trains emotion far more effectively than reflection alone. This is why journaling without action often deepens negativity instead of resolving it. The mind becomes better at articulating problems while remaining unchanged. Insight accumulates, but power does not. Over time, the individual becomes eloquent about their limitations and convinced of their immobility. This is one of the most dangerous psychological traps because it feels intelligent while producing stagnation. Action interrupts negative thinking at its root. Not massive action, not reckless action, but committed action. A decision followed by execution collapses dozens of hypothetical fears instantly. The mind learns through consequence, not contemplation. Confidence is not built by thinking positively. It is built by surviving your own effort. This is also why environment is not a minor variable. The people you listen to, the conversations you normalize, the tone of information you consume, all of these train your inner voice. Negative environments do not force negativity, they legitimize it. Over time, standards erode, complaints sound reasonable, mediocrity sounds justified, discipline sounds extreme. Distance from such environments is not cruelty, it is hygiene. What most people call loyalty is often fear of standing alone. But growth almost always requires a period of psychological solitude. Not isolation, but separation from voices that reinforce your old self. Jim Rohn's insistence on personal development was ultimately about self-authorship. If you do not author your inner dialogue, someone else will, or worse, no one will, and entropy will take over. The decision to win, which he spoke about repeatedly, is not about outcome certainty. It is about identity commitment. When quitting is removed as an option, the mind reorganizes, creativity increases, resourcefulness emerges, excuses lose credibility. The brain begins to ask different questions, not because it is inspired, but because it is constrained. Constraints sharpen focus. Unlimited options breed procrastination. Negative thinking flourishes where exit is always available. The moment you decide that retreat is no longer on the table, thought patterns adjust. This is not motivation. This is pressure applied correctly. Pressure either crushes or refines. Discipline determines which. The deeper truth beneath all of this is uncomfortable. Your life is a reflection of the conversations you allow inside your head. Not the ones you hear once, but the ones you replay. Not the thoughts that appear, but the thoughts you believe. Killing negative thinking is not about suppression. It is about non-cooperation. You stop feeding narratives that weaken you. You stop identifying with internal commentary that produces no forward motion. From that point on, progress becomes less dramatic but more reliable. You stop waiting to feel ready. You stop asking for permission. You stop negotiating with moods. You act according to standards, not emotions. And slowly, almost quietly, the mind follows. Negative thinking dies not in a moment of inspiration, but in a season of consistency. It dies because it is starved of attention, starved of rehearsal, starved of tolerance. What replaces it is not blind optimism, but grounded confidence, not excitement, but direction, not noise, but clarity. And clarity, sustained over time, changes everything. One of the most confusing realities of human behavior is that intelligence does not protect against self-sabotage. In fact, it often amplifies it. Intelligent people are usually better at explaining why they should not act than why they should. They generate sophisticated justifications, elegant doubts, and convincing narratives that delay action indefinitely. The mind becomes a courtroom where every impulse toward progress is cross-examined until it collapses under the weight of overanalysis. This is not depth, it is avoidance wearing the mask of intelligence. Negative thinking thrives in this environment because it offers certainty without risk. It tells you exactly why something will not work, why the timing is wrong, why you are not ready yet, and because these thoughts are coherent, they feel authoritative. The problem is that authority is being granted to a voice that has never built anything. Most negative thoughts are not insights, they are habits. They repeat because repetition feels stable, not because it is true. This is why motivation fails so consistently. Motivation is emotional energy. It spikes and fades. It depends on mood, inspiration, and circumstance. Discipline, on the other hand, is structural. It does not require belief. It requires agreement. When you agree in advance on how you will act regardless of mood, thinking loses its veto power. The mind is no longer consulted on whether action should occur. It is tasked only with how to execute. Jim Rohn never framed discipline as punishment. He framed it as freedom. The disciplined mind is not constantly renegotiating its own commitments. It does not wake up every day asking whether effort is justified. That question has already been answered. This removes friction, and friction is what exhausts people far more than effort itself. Self-sabotage is not self-hatred. It is self-protection against imagined failure. The mind prefers a story where potential is preserved over a reality where effort is tested. This is why people stay almost ready for years. As long as the attempt is postponed, the identity of capability remains intact. The moment action occurs, the fantasy collapses into feedback. Feedback is honest, and honesty threatens ego. Killing negative thinking, then, is not about positivity. It is about ending the internal negotiation. You do not argue with thoughts. You outgrow them through behavior. Each small act of discipline weakens the authority of doubt. Each completed task rewires expectation. Over time, the mind learns that action does not lead to annihilation. It leads to adjustment. Adjustment is the real reward. People who wait to feel confident before acting misunderstand the sequence. Confidence is not a prerequisite. It is a residue. It is what remains after repeated exposure to effort and survival. The brain calibrates based on experience, not intention. No amount of affirmations will override a pattern of avoidance. But a pattern of action, even imperfect action, will override years of hesitation. This is why routines matter more than goals. Goals are abstract. Routines are embodied. A routine trains the nervous system to move forward without drama. It removes decision fatigue. It neutralizes emotional volatility. Over time, the routine becomes identity. You stop being someone who tries and become someone who does. Negative thinking cannot survive in a system that produces evidence. It requires ambiguity. It requires space to speculate. Consistent execution collapses that space. The mind becomes quieter not because it is silenced, but because it is occupied with reality. This is also why many people fear consistency. Consistency removes excuses. If you act every day, even modestly, you can no longer attribute stagnation to bad luck or unfair conditions. Responsibility becomes unavoidable, and responsibility is heavy for those who have built their identity around complaint. Yet responsibility is also empowering. It restores authorship. It shifts the locus of control inward. The moment you accept that your thinking patterns are trainable, you reclaim agency. You are no longer at the mercy of mood. You are no longer waiting for inspiration. You are building a system that functions even when you do not feel like it. Jim Rohn's emphasis on daily personal development was not about constant improvement. It was about preventing decay. Minds decay when unattended. Standards decay when unprotected. Character decays when comfort becomes the primary value. Daily discipline is not about becoming extraordinary. It is about not becoming weak by default. Most people do not fail dramatically. They drift. They drift into distraction, into rationalization, into lower expectations. Negative thinking accelerates this drift by making it feel justified. Killing it requires friction in the opposite direction. Structure. standards, repetition. At a certain point, negative thinking loses its emotional charge. It still appears, but it sounds outdated, like advice from a former version of yourself. You hear it without obeying it. You recognize it without identifying with it. This is the quiet victory most people never reach because they keep waiting for the mind to change before the behavior does. The order is always the same. Behavior first, thinking second, identity last. And once that order is respected, progress stops feeling heroic and starts feeling inevitable. Negative thinking does not survive merely because it is familiar. It survives because it offers something far more seductive, psychological certainty. Even when that certainty is painful, it feels safer than ambiguity. The mind would rather be certain and miserable than uncertain and exposed. This is why suffering so often feels justified. It provides a narrative that explains everything, even if that explanation costs you your future. There is a strange comfort in negativity. It lowers expectation. It preemptively explains failure. It protects the ego from disappointment by never allowing hope to rise too high. In this way, negative thinking functions like emotional insurance. You pay with possibilities so you do not have to face surprise. Over time, this trade becomes automatic. The individual begins to confuse caution with wisdom and resignation with maturity. This is where many intelligent people become trapped. Their reasoning skills do not free them, they fortify the cage. They learn to argue convincingly for limitation. They develop philosophies that sanctify inaction. They mistake emotional numbness for balance. From the outside, they appear thoughtful. Internally, they are stalled. Pain feels meaningful when purpose is absent. This is a brutal truth. When someone lacks direction, suffering becomes the only thing that gives weight to existence. Complaining, worrying, replaying past mistakes, these behaviors create the illusion of engagement. Something is happening, even if nothing is changing. Negative thinking fills the vacuum left by unused potential. Jim Rohn never romanticized struggle. He understood that hardship without intention degrades rather than refines. What refines is voluntary difficulty. Discipline chosen freely produces strength. Difficulty endured passively produces bitterness. This distinction explains why two people can experience the same setback and emerge completely different. One uses it as data. The other uses it as identity. Identity is where the real battle occurs. Most people attempt to change thoughts without questioning who they believe themselves to be. But thoughts obey identity, not the other way around. If you see yourself as someone who is unlucky, overlooked, or fundamentally flawed, your mind will generate thoughts consistent with that self-image. Trying to think positively on top of a negative identity is like painting over rot. The work, then, is not positive thinking. It is identity reconstruction. This does not mean inventing fantasies about greatness. It means choosing a more functional self-concept, one grounded in behavior rather than emotion, one defined by standards rather than stories. I am someone who does what they said they would do today, is infinitely more powerful than I am someone who feels confident. Confidence that is not anchored to action collapses under pressure. Confidence that emerges from repeated self-trust does not require maintenance. Each time you keep a small promise to yourself, the mind updates its assessment. Slowly, skepticism weakens. The internal critic loses authority because evidence contradicts it. This is how negative thinking actually dies. Not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. The mind stops producing certain thoughts when they no longer match lived reality. When action consistently disproves doubt, doubt becomes noise. It may still appear, but it no longer feels persuasive. It loses emotional gravity. Most people never reach this stage because they abandon the process too early. They expect internal alignment before external effort. They wait to feel different before acting differently. But feelings lag behind behavior. Always. The nervous system recalibrates based on exposure and outcome, not intention. This is why discomfort must be reinterpreted. Discomfort is not a signal of danger. It is a signal of neural update. When you act against old patterns, discomfort arises because the system is adjusting. Interpreting this sensation as a reason to stop guarantees stagnation. Interpreting it as evidence of growth changes everything. Negative thinking often intensifies right before it loses relevance. This is not coincidence. When old identities are threatened, they resist. The mind escalates doubt, fear, and rationalization to regain control. This phase is where most people retreat. They mistake resistance for truth. In reality, resistance is a sign that something structural is being dismantled. The solution is not to argue with the mind during this phase. Argument keeps you at the same level. The solution is to continue acting. Action bypasses debate. It rewrites the system from the outside in. Over time, a new baseline forms. What once required effort becomes default. The mind stops scanning for reasons to stop and starts scanning for ways to proceed. This is not optimism. It is efficiency. Negativity is inefficient. It consumes energy without producing results. Once the mind experiences the efficiency of forward motion, it adapts. This is where many people misinterpret the outcome. They think they have become positive. They have not. They have become directed. Direction replaces rumination. Purpose replaces anxiety. Structure replaces chaos. The garden analogy Jim Rohn used remains precise. You do not eliminate weeds by staring at them or hating them. You eliminate them by cultivating something stronger. Healthy growth crowds out decay. Negative thinking cannot compete with a life that produces tangible proof of progress, however modest. Eventually, you stop asking how to kill negative thinking. The question dissolves. Your days are filled with execution, learning, adjustment, and rest. The mind has less unused space to pollute. Thought becomes a tool again, not a tyrant. At this stage, success stops being dramatic. It becomes cumulative. Small disciplines stack. Small corrections compound. The individual no longer feels like they are fighting themselves. They are aligned enough to move. This alignment is the real achievement Jim Rohn was pointing toward. Not wealth, not status, but the internal condition that makes progress sustainable. A mind that works with you instead of against you. A self-concept grounded in action. A standard that does not collapse under pressure. Negative thinking dies quietly in such a system. It is not slain. It is outgrown. And what replaces it is not constant confidence, but something far more reliable, momentum. At a certain point, the mind stops asking whether negative thinking will return. That question itself belongs to an earlier stage. What replaces it is something quieter and far more stable, orientation. The individual is no longer focused on eliminating thoughts, managing moods, or fixing themselves. Their attention has shifted outward toward execution, refinement, and contribution. Thinking has resumed its proper role as a servant, not a supervisor. This is where most motivational frameworks quietly fail, because they never address maintenance. They assume that once clarity is reached, it will sustain itself. But clarity, like physical fitness, decays without structure. Jim Rohn understood this implicitly. His emphasis on daily practice was not about constant improvement, it was about preventing regression. Regression is subtle. It arrives disguised as comfort, distraction, and lowered vigilance. The mind does not collapse suddenly. It softens. Standards loosen. Small compromises accumulate. What once felt unacceptable becomes tolerable. This is how negative thinking re-enters, not as crisis, but as background noise. The individual stops noticing it because it feels familiar. Familiarity is the greatest threat to progress. Maintenance, then, is not about intensity. It is about non-negotiables. A few core behaviors that are protected regardless of circumstance. Reading even when tired. Writing goals even when uninspired. Acting even when doubt resurfaces. These behaviors anchor identity. They remind the nervous system who is in charge. People often misunderstand this phase and assume it requires constant effort. It does not. It requires consistency. Consistency eventually reduces effort because the system becomes self-regulating. The mind learns what is expected. Resistance decreases. Friction fades. What once felt like discipline becomes normalcy. This normalization is crucial. When growth feels normal, self-sabotage loses its drama. There is nothing left to rebel against. The individual is no longer trying to become someone else. They are simply maintaining alignment with who they have already proven themselves to be. At this stage, ambition changes again. Goals remain, but they no longer define self-worth. Winning is no longer an emotional necessity. It becomes a strategic objective. Losses are processed cleanly. Wins are enjoyed briefly, then integrated. The emotional spikes that once accompanied success and failure flatten into steady competence. This is what people mistake for complacency when they observe it from the outside. In reality, it is internal security. The person is no longer driven by fear of inadequacy. They are driven by standards. Standards do not shout, they endure. Jim Rohn's insistence on deciding to win was never about obsessing over victory. It was about removing the option to collapse. Once collapse is off the table, the mind stops catastrophizing. It no longer needs to rehearse worst-case scenarios endlessly. Energy is freed, attention sharpens, life simplifies. This is the paradox few understand. When you no longer need success to feel whole, you become far more capable of achieving it. Desperation distorts judgment, calm refines it. Negative thinking thrives on urgency. Clear thinking thrives on proportion. The individual who has integrated this no longer scans their mind for negativity. They notice it the way one notices a passing sound, without engagement. There is no internal debate, no moral struggle, just recognition and continuation. This is not suppression, it is maturity. Maturity is the ability to experience internal weather without reorganizing your entire life around it. From here, life takes on a different texture. Days are less dramatic but more productive. There is less emotional storytelling and more tangible output. Less explanation, more execution. Less need to be understood, more satisfaction in being effective. This effectiveness compounds quietly. Relationships stabilize because reactions are predictable. Work improves because focus is uninterrupted. Health improves because stress is no longer chronic. None of this feels miraculous. It feels earned. The final integration is subtle but decisive. You stop framing your life as a battle against negativity. That framing keeps negativity central. Instead, you frame your life around construction. What you are building today. What skill you are refining. What standard you are reinforcing. Negative thinking cannot survive in a life oriented toward building. It requires stagnation. It requires excess mental space. It requires unresolved identity. Construction resolves all three. This is why the most disciplined people rarely speak about discipline. They speak about work, about process, about iteration. The internal drama has been resolved enough that it no longer needs airtime. Jim Rohn's legacy was not motivational speech. It was this orientation, the shift from emotional reaction to deliberate design, from wishing to building, from mental noise to mental order. When this order stabilizes, success stops being the goal. It becomes a byproduct. And when success is a byproduct, it stops owning you. At that point, negative thinking has already lost. Not because it was defeated, but because it no longer has a role to play. The mind has been given something better to do. What most people never realize is that the end of negative thinking does not feel like a victory. There is no moment of triumph, no internal applause, no dramatic shift in personality. It feels almost disappointing at first. Quiet, ordinary, like nothing special has happened. And that is precisely how you know it is real. Because real change does not announce itself. It integrates. When negative thinking finally loosens its grip, the mind does not become empty. It becomes occupied, not with noise, but with direction. There is less commentary about the self and more engagement with the task at hand. Less internal narration, more presence. The mind stops circling itself and starts moving outward again, toward execution, refinement, contribution. This is the point where many people mislabel what they are experiencing. They think they have lost motivation or become less emotional. In truth, they have simply stopped feeding a system that required constant stimulation to survive. Drama fades when it is no longer rehearsed. Intensity fades when it is no longer needed to compensate for chaos. Calm is not the absence of ambition. It is the absence of internal friction. At this stage, effort becomes strangely clean. You do what needs to be done without negotiating with yourself first. You still experience doubt, fatigue, and resistance, but they no longer dictate behavior. They pass through awareness without hijacking it. You are no longer asking, "How do I feel about this?" before acting. You are asking, "What does the standard require?" Standards are quieter than emotions. but infinitely more reliable. This is why people who reach this stage often struggle to explain it to others. There is nothing flashy to point to. No technique, no mantra, no single insight, just a gradual reorganization of inner authority. Thought is no longer the ruler. It is an advisor, sometimes a useful one, sometimes a noisy one, but never sovereign. Sovereignty has returned to action. Jim Rohn's insistence on personal responsibility was never about blame. It was about authorship. When you accept that you are the author of your inner life, excuses lose their appeal, complaints lose their function, self-pity loses its moral leverage. None of these things help you build, and building has become the central value. This is the final transition most people never complete. They want relief from negativity, but they do not want to replace it with responsibility. They want peace without structure. But peace without structure is temporary. Structure without peace is oppressive. The integration of both is maturity. Maturity does not feel inspiring. It feels stable. You stop needing to convince yourself you are capable. You already know what you can do because you have done it repeatedly. The mind no longer needs to inflate or diminish the self. It reports. It adjusts. It moves on. Identity becomes grounded in behavior rather than belief. At this point, success no longer defines you. Failure no longer threatens you. Both become information, useful, sometimes painful, but not personal. This emotional neutrality is not coldness. It is freedom from unnecessary interpretation. Negative thinking depended on interpretation. It needed stories. It needed meaning layered onto every experience. Once interpretation quiets, negativity starves. There is nothing left for it to attach to. The irony is that many people abandon the process just before this stage because it feels anticlimactic. They expected fireworks. Instead, they find silence. They mistake silence for emptiness and return to familiar noise. But those who stay discover that silence is not empty. It is functional. In silence, focus deepens. In focus, skill sharpens. In skill, confidence stabilizes. In confidence, life simplifies. This is not enlightenment, it is alignment. Alignment between what you think, what you do, and who you are becoming. When those three stop contradicting each other, energy stops leaking, fatigue decreases, decision-making accelerates. You become harder to destabilize not because you are stronger emotionally, but because there is less internal conflict to exploit. This is why truly disciplined people appear unbothered. They are not suppressing reactions. They simply do not experience the same level of internal provocation. There is no committee inside arguing over every move. The decision-making hierarchy is clear. And clarity, sustained long enough, reshapes a life. At the very end of this process, something subtle but profound occurs. You stop thinking of negative thinking as an enemy. Enemies imply struggle. Struggle implies attention. Attention implies importance. Negative thinking does not deserve importance. It was a phase, a pattern, a system that once served you and now does not. You do not kill it with violence. You outgrow it through usefulness. The mind, like any system, obeys incentives. When building becomes more rewarding than complaining. When execution becomes more satisfying than analysis. When progress becomes more familiar than stagnation. The system updates. Old patterns dissolve without ceremony. This is the quiet success Jim Rohn was pointing toward all along. Not the loud success of recognition, but the internal success of self-command. The ability to govern your inner world well enough that the outer world stops feeling overwhelming. From there, life does not become easy. It becomes manageable, which is far more valuable. You still face uncertainty. You still encounter resistance. You still make mistakes. But none of these derail you because your center of gravity has shifted. You are no longer living inside your reactions. You are operating from your standards. Standards do not panic. They persist. And when persistence replaces panic, negative thinking has already lost its last stronghold. There is nothing left to dismantle, only something to maintain. So the question is no longer how to kill negative thinking. The question becomes whether you are willing to build a life so structured, so directed, and so grounded in action that negative thinking no longer has a reason to exist. That is not a motivational question. It is a design decision. And once made, It quietly shapes everything that follows.